on behalf of the board and staff of Environmental Advocates of New York, it's my pleasure to offer our perspective on how best the New York State can deal with the pressing issue of climate change. And let me just commend you all for holding this first ever hearing of the New York State Environmental Conservation Committee on climate, and particularly on the CCPA. Let me just, you have my written testimony. I'm going to be super brief in my oral remarks as well. The history of the CCPA, let me start there. The Climate and Community Protection Act was developed with leaders of groups from the front lines and in conversations with communities across the state. It represents the input of leaders from the social justice, from civic, environmental justice, labor, clean energy movements, and local and state and national environmental groups. For the past 3 years, the CCPA has been passed by the New York State Assembly with bipartisan support. In fact, one of the first acts of Assembly Speaker Carl Hastie that he took was to create the actual climate change working group that Chairman Engelbright from the Assembly here today chairs. That was done almost 4 years ago next week. Steve Engelbright and his colleagues held roundtables on climate change in 2015 and gave life and a pathway for the emergence of what is now known as the CCPA as a legislative response to climate change. Though last year, as many of you know, the CCPA had bipartisan majority of senators signed on as co-sponsors, the then leaders blocked the will of its members and refused to bring the CCPA up for a vote. The CCPA sets a path to the highest standard nationwide for reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. 100% of human-caused climate pollution eliminated no later than 2050 from all sectors of New York State's economy. While the State Energy Plan has an aspirational goal of reducing 80% of all greenhouse gas emissions, the backers of the CCPA decided that the goal of reducing 100% of anthropogenic emissions was a more direct way of conveying that we are to move this state entirely off of fossil fuels no later than 2050. The out-year mandate of the CCPA ensures surety for frontline communities and for those looking to invest in the long-term clean energy markets. This responsible timeline and clear planning process detailing how New York will achieve its goals will provide businesses and communities a roadmap to thrive in New York in the new economy. The bill not only mandates an economy-wide shift to clean renewable energy, but it also defines the provisions which prioritize dedicating, and this is important, a question Senator Salazar just asked, dedicating existing and future resources towards vulnerable, impacted, historically disadvantaged, and frontline communities. It does so in law, not as an administrative decision, and that's an important distinction. The CCPA also includes provisions that also reorient state government decisions so that decisions align with statutory goals, and it provides tools for the public to hold state agencies accountable. Absent statutory obligations, all we have are lofty rhetorical goals. Let me just touch on briefly why we believe that common sense is really what the CCPA is about. First, New York State has a rich history of providing leadership on air pollution and climate issues. I won't go over in detail, my written testimony has it, but the acid lane law, first in the nation, led to federal decisions. New York State opted into the California electric vehicle program in 1992 under then Governor Mario Cuomo. The car makers say we couldn't do it. Allies in the Business Council told them they couldn't do it. But New York State actually adopted those standards, even though there was legislation trying to thwart the administration at the time from moving ahead. And on Reggie, this is a funny story that's personal to me. On Reggie, we were actually told by the power companies under Reggie that 3 different things were going to happen. First, Reggie was going to drive prices through the roof. Second, there'd be blackouts in New York City. Third, and this is really unbelievable, but I was told this directly, the power companies were actually going to shut down in New York and move to Pennsylvania just to avoid Reggie. What a great history. None of that happened, as you know. Common sense prevailed. I'm going to touch on real briefly a couple of different states and their history here. California and Massachusetts set their climate goals in law in 2006 and 2008, respectively. In the 10 years since enactment of its law in California, climate pollution has been cut more than 11%. And when the states, even though the state's population grew 8.5% in that time period, California is now the 5th largest economy. They surpassed the United Kingdom last year in the globe. So leadership can really drive a lot of powerful decisions. So we really think it's time to act. It's time to ignore the doubters and deniers. They'll distract us from what we really should be our focus. In fact, Environmental Advocates urges you to join us in choosing to side with the innovators and the entrepreneurs and the workers who really embody that American can-do spirit. We think we can provide clean energy, great jobs, benefits to our communities over time, and we can do so in a way that actually doesn't harm our economy. So I just want to finish on a couple more quick points. I know I'm slightly over time.
Yeah, so I think we're going to have a lot of questions for you, so I'm sure you could insert the points there. We want to be strict with the time limit. Let me just ask you this. As someone who's a proponent of the bill, and as someone who's testifying very early on in today's hearing, and I'm sure we'll have maybe even the next witness be a little more skeptical of the bill than you are. Tell us what gives you faith that we will be able to meet the 2050 goals and that they are practical, especially in the spheres that aren't addressed in the current budget and that the previous witness said were a little less mature. What gives you faith that in our homes, in our cars, in our buildings, that we will be able to get to decarbonize, as the term was used, by 2050?
Right. So I lean on the other states, the states that have gone before us and are true leaders in this space and have grown economy-wide standards and are moving to all sectors of the economy. They have robust plans. They are developing the regulatory pathway that I think we can copy, particularly California. I mean, just in December, California enacted groundbreaking new regulations to require all transit buses in their state to be electric by 2040. So we can build on the leading states that have gone before us that have shown that pathway. I'll also sort of point to your attention. In 2010, the state actually released a draft climate action plan that was developed pursuant to Executive Order 24. It is a wonderful roadmap. At the time it was released, it was looked at as not necessarily an environmental policy entirely, but it was looked at as a blueprint for how New York can get to where we are now to where we want to be in 2050. So New York State has actually had a goal by pursuant to executive order since 2009 that we're going to cut climate pollution overall 80% by 2050. And I think implementation of that goal has been the thing that's been lacking in political will. I'll add two more key points. When you look at the queue of renewable energy projects that sits waiting for approval by the State Energy Siting Board, that gives us a lot of hope that in the electricity sector, there's a lot of pent-up energy to site new renewables. The second key point, because we stood firm in 1992 with bold goals that envisioned electric vehicles on our streets when they didn't even exist in 1992, and think of how many there are now, because we held firm in that time period, we don't have to go out and invent an electric car. They're here. What we need is the political will, the concerted energy, and statutory obligations that lead us to that pathway.
Thank you. Yes, Senator Harkin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony. Quick question. You highlighted one difference early in your testimony. The difference between this legislation and the governor's plan was that this had actually measurable and quantifiable goals that would be held to account. Can you list, say, a couple of other quantifiable advantages in this legislation versus the governor's proposal? I was sort of hoping that the CEO of NYSERDA would speak more specifically on this bill and didn't. So if you could address what the advantages of this legislation versus the governor's proposals are.
Yeah, well, let me first just acknowledge that I think it's a nice evolution in the executive's stance. For the past 8 years, they did not advance anything like a climate action council before the legislature, nor a piece of legislation that would put climate policy in law. They preferred to do it by administrative fiat, and I think this is an important evolution in their approach. I would have commended them to read a bit more thoroughly the executive order that led to the Climate Action Council. It's a more robust council. So right out of the gates is a more robust council that already exists, but I think the legislation before you involves more stakeholders, a broader segment of not only state agencies, but also brings in the positions of disadvantaged communities. As I said at the beginning, the CCPA was developed from conversations with people in the front line. It wasn't a bill that existed that then we modified. It was developed literally at the grassroots and neighborhood level upwards over time. So then that's a big distinction, is the makeup of the Climate Action Council. Another key piece is the mandate that 40% of clean energy funds, much of which flows from NYSERDA through Reggie and through the Clean Energy Fund itself, would be dedicated to disadvantaged communities right out of the gate. That's designed solely with their input in mind. because one, they represent such a big part of the population, and two, let's face it, I mean, disadvantaged communities aren't the ones that are the leading cause of the climate crisis, but they're the ones on the front lines of the impacts. Third, mandatory labor standards. So not done through orders or in solicitations, but actually having labor standards and law is very important. And our labor partners in NY Renews were really committed to helping us write the bill that way and ensuring it's successfully written that way. Third, there's some legal enforcement in the CCPA that's lacking in the governor's bill. I mean, there's a provision in the language that requires all state decision makings to go through several screens. An equity screen to make sure that the decisions are equitable and benefit disadvantaged communities. Climate screens to make sure that we're actually making decisions that advance the goals rather than hinder it. You know, there's a wonderful example just across the road here at Sheridan Avenue, and I know you're going to hear about more about that later. But the executive is actually proposing to swap out dirty diesel generators with fossil fuel. Why would we power the building we're in with anything less of renewable energy if we were firmly committed to climate standards in this state? And then last but not least, there's accountability to allow that people would have standing in court to enforce when the state agencies made decisions that weren't aligned with these goals. All these pieces really hang together to ensure that not only do we have goals and standards in law, but they're robust, they're enforceable. You can actually see a pathway towards achieving those goals, so we don't wake up in 2049 and say, oops, we kind of forgot to do some stuff. You know, and that's what leading states are doing. I commend you to talk to the folks in California and what they're doing. They've blazed the trail on this stuff. They know what they're doing. There's a reason why nationally we can copy California standards, and we should be doing it day in and day out here in New York.
Great, thank you.
One question I have is that why is there needed the strictness of having a renewable goal as opposed to using other sources of energy such as let's say gas coming from an anaerobic digester or something, making up the portfolio of what is possible under this bill? It's like pretty strict in what's allowable, and some that have talked to me, and many of us have just talked about wanting some added flexibility. If it's not putting carbon into the world, why can't it be considered under this bill as something that makes up, you know, what our targets are?
Yeah. Well, I think we tried to emulate the clean energy standard that was in the state's renewable portfolio standard, and I think we also wanted to move the state towards a system that was less dirty and less dangerous. There are a lot of technologies out there that may purport to be carbon neutral or actually reduce carbon emissions, but let's take the whole issue of wood burning, and let's take that issue straight on. I mean, when you burn wood, you can actually have more soot particles than when you burn coal. I don't think we should have a climate policy that's going to harm public health by requiring people to to inhale more soot. Anybody that knows the science behind soot particles knows that it's a huge asthma trigger for people who have asthma.
Yeah,
It'll trigger second heart attacks, and it'll also trigger cases of lung cancer and premature death. So you don't want to, err on the side of thinking too much on climate change and then drive up emissions elsewhere.
I'm anti-soot, for the record.
I'm glad you are.
Any other senators? Senator Hoylman?
Thank you. And thank you, Senator Kaminsky, for your leadership in convening this hearing. It's so important. And thank you, Peter, for your work. Quick question about Reggie, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. How much has been swept from Reggie over the last, I don't know, few years?
Wish I had the number in the top of my head. I'll have to get you the actual figure. But for the last several years, the state budget has taken Reggie dollars away at about $23 million a year. So maybe 3 or 4 years, you're getting close to more than $100 million has been swept with Reggie.
And what happens to that money?
Well, it just goes into the general fund. It's been loosely tied to a series of tax credits that have existed for, actually many of them existed before Reggie was even done. So, I mean, these are legacy tax credits that have been on the books for years, should have been baked into the state finance plan for years. But several years back, the executive proposed, and the legislature went around with, taking $23 million out of Reggie fund to sort of, just throw it into the general fund so that $23 million could be spent elsewhere.
And does the CCPA have any mechanism to stop that from happening, or to?
Well, the CCPA, by virtue of requiring 40% of Reggie dollars to go to frontline communities, should help put that into an end. But it's a good suggestion that maybe we should be looking at codifying or refusing the governor's proposal in this executive budget to once again raid Reggie.
Thank you.
So Let me just say before I wrap up, because Senator O'Mara may ask the question, but I do have solar panels in my house generating 100% of my power, unlike other institutions. So
That's good.
I'm talking the talk and walking the walk
And I
here.
think Solar City ought to have them on their roof, too. But thank you for that. Am I up?
You are.
Yeah, all right, thank you. We talk in these objectives about the percentage of renewable energy or clean energy we're going to have. And really, we're not talking in the amount of decreased greenhouse gas emissions as much as we are talking about using renewable energy. What is the overall impact going to be of us getting to 100% renewable? How much greenhouse gas emissions are we going to reduce?
Well, the Climate and Community Protection Act before you actually speaks to both, not only renewable energy targets in law, but actually a standard where we eliminate 100% of anthropogenic emissions, which is essentially the same thing as saying we'll reduce 80% of all greenhouse gases by 2050. So there is a greenhouse gas emissions limit and a pathway to achieve it. And it sets up a sort of a robust process at DEC and the other agencies to figure out all the different regulatory standards that we'll need to put in place to literally sort of look chimney by chimney, tailpipe by tailpipe, and stack by stack, how to eliminate anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases, which is, Senator, the functional equivalent of moving the entire economy of New York State off of fossil fuels combustion.
And what does that impact going to be in the grand scheme of global climate change?
In terms of percentage-wise?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's an important down payment of what a state like New York should do to help drive not only the rest of the states in the region, but also nationally. And if New York State leads, which I think our leadership is sorely needed right now, that will, and is typically brought along other northeastern states and other leading states to emulate sort of what's happening in California, Massachusetts, and elsewhere. The hope is, in the absence of federal leadership, that states leading will get an actual climate reduction policy worthy of international goals, and we'll start to get closer to where we need to be underneath the Paris climate agreements.
And I agree that the initiative is an important one. I am skeptical of the goals that we have and the like. And, you know, we're talking about electricity, and we're not talking about heating so much. And over 95% of our heating fuel is fossil fuels today, is my understanding. So, you know, does this package of legislation, is this dealing with converting every building and home to electricity as opposed to, you know, what really is, you know, I think natural gas has certainly cleaned things up a lot. It's not totally clean, but it's cleaner than other forms of heat that we've been, fuels we've been utilizing. But how do we in our economy convert every building and every home to electric heat?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly, as you laid out the challenge, and yes, this bill, by doing 100% of greenhouse gas emissions from the anthropogenic sources, will touch on all combustion, heating, hot water for residential, commercial, even every vehicle needs to be moved over to electric drive over time. That's going to be an enormous challenge for us, but I hope you'll also appreciate what a wonderful opportunity for a state like New York to create huge economic opportunity for people here to be installing the next generation of heating and cooling systems that are powered by electricity, which is also carbon-free over time, rather than sticking with the dirty and dangerous ways of the past. So it is going to sort of touch on everything. And I can just tell you, today I was to be in a meeting in New York City with a bunch of architects. We're actually putting our building through a process during a renovation. And our charge to those architects is develop a plan where we move our building here in Albany off of fossil fuels. So we are going to look at a whole house sort of system, a highly efficient setup for our building that would be devoid of fossil fuels at our facility. And we're told if we get close to net zero energy, we'll be the first building here in the Capital District to do it. So stay tuned on that charge.
Do you have an idea what that cost would be for your building?
I'm not there at the meeting today. We'll try to get back to you as to what we're looking at. But I mean, we also have to look at what are the significant benefits. I mean, the Northeast Climate Impact Assessment looked at, you know, what would happen if we don't act in New York. we're talking about, 650 premature deaths in New York City if we don't act by 2050. That number can balloon to 2,300 premature deaths by the end of this century if we don't act on climate. So while we're looking at the costs, we also have to really thoroughly understand the moral imperative to address the benefits of saving lives, or providing great economic opportunities for workers here as we transition off of fossil fuels.
One final question. It probably was more appropriate for Ms. Barton, but we ran out of time there.
Well, I won't speak for her.
No, I'm not asking you to. But with obviously with the conversion of these types of things to electric heat, for example, is going to be a huge demand for electricity. More vehicles, electric vehicles on the road, more demand. Do we have an estimate of what our peak demand is going to grow to in New York State? If we have roughly an annual peak demand of about 33,000 megawatts, that's certainly going to grow. And are we factoring these 50% and 100% figures in on that growth? If right now we're talking to get to 15 or 16 megawatts, eventually 30 megawatts, 1,000 megawatts to cover. There's going to be growth in that demand. Are we accounting for that looking forward? And what do you, if you have an estimate of what that growth is going to be?
Well, it's hard to say what the growth's going to be, because also a key piece of, any good smart climate strategy, which the administration has and this bill contemplates, is huge amounts of energy efficiency and weatherization. I'm going to use my own personal experience as another great example. When I went through NYSERDA's program and weatherized my home and upgraded it to be more energy efficiency several years before we did solar, we wanted to ensure that we sipped electrons rather than gulped them anymore. We cut our electricity consumption month over month for a full 12-month period by a third. Now imagine if we did that across New York State. First, they're amazing jobs, because I can attest to how many workers were in my home those several days doing all this work. But the second thing is that it can actually have a huge impact on what we'll need going forward. I don't think we're going to actually need the amount of motor vehicles that we have currently over time, and I think we won't see 30 years from now 11.2 million vehicles on our streets, because people are going to live and get between point A and point B a lot differently than we are now. So I think you have to also consider that there's going to be a dramatic reduction in the amount of electricity that we'll consume, because we'll be smarter and wiser and be using those precious electrons produced by sun and wind much more wisely.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Great, thanks again.